March 30th, 1998. Florida State Prison, Starkey. 7:01 a.m. The sun had barely risen over the humid Florida morning when the execution team came for her. Judy Buenoano was 54 years old. Her head had been freshly shaved. Guards had covered it with gel to ensure proper electrical conductivity. Gone were the painted, manicured fingernails and the fashionable dark hair. Gone was the tough-edged woman who drove around Pensacola in a Corvette and told bigger-than-life stories about her life, her businesses, and her Chanel perfume. Guards helped the frail-looking Buenoano walk into the death chamber at 7:02 a.m. Barely filling the seat of the large oaken chair, she was strapped in. She clenched her fists, shut her eyes and lowered her head as prison officials securely strapped her into the wooden chair. She didn't look at the 46 witnesses behind a glass partition. The witnesses included prison officials, media representatives, prosecutors who'd spent years building cases against her, and family members of the people she'd murdered. They sat in silence, watching through thick glass as the state of Florida prepared to execute a woman for the first time in 150 years. The warden stepped forward and asked the traditional question, "Do you have any last words?" Her eyes remained shut, and she whispered, "No, sir." She made no final statement, no apology, no confession, no acknowledgement of what she'd done to the people who'd trusted her most. Just silence. The same silence she'd maintained for over a decade on death row, insisting on her innocence despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. At 7:08 a.m., the power was turned on. 2,300 volts of electricity surged through Judy Buenoano's body. She flinched, hands still in fists as smoke rose from her bare right leg. Her body stiffened against the restraints. The current flowed through her for approximately 1 minute, 60 seconds of controlled electrocution designed to stop her heart and end her life. The prisoner was pronounced dead at 7:13 a.m. EST, said Rhonda Horler, a prison spokeswoman who witnessed the execution. It was the day that would have been her drowned son's 37th birthday. Michael Goodyear, the son Judy had poisoned with arsenic, crippled with paralysis and then drowned in a canoe, would have turned 37 on March 30th. Instead, he'd been dead for 18 years, murdered by his own mother for insurance money. Judy Buenoano became the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, and only the third woman executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. She was the first woman to get the electric chair in America since Rhonda Bell Martin was executed in Alabama on October 11, 1957. But Judy wasn't a good mother who'd been wrongfully convicted, as she'd claimed in her final interviews. She was a serial killer who'd murdered her husband, poisoned and drowned her son, tried to murder her fiancé with a car bomb and likely killed her boyfriend. She collected more than $240,000 in insurance money from the deaths of her husband, a son, and a boyfriend in Colorado. She'd turned murder into a business, viewing the men in her life as nothing more than financial opportunities. And the path to Florida's electric chair began decades earlier, in a childhood that would shape everything that followed. Judy Welty was born in Quanah, Texas, on April 4, 1943. She was the third of 4 siblings. Her early childhood was spent in the heat and poverty of rural Texas, in a family that was already fragile and would soon shatter completely. When she was 4 years old, her mother died. The loss was devastating for young Judius. She and her younger brother, Robert, were sent to live with their grandparents. For a brief time, there was stability. Grandparents who cared for them. A home that felt safe. The routine comfort of family. But that stability didn't last. Their father remarried a woman, with 2 sons of her own. The 2 Welty children moved to join him and the step-family in Roswell, New Mexico. What happened in that household would become a subject of dispute. Judius was reportedly abused by her father and stepmother, who starved her and forced her to work as a slave. She would later claim horrific abuse, physical punishment, emotional torment, being treated as less than human, while her stepmother's biological children were favored and protected. Whether the abuse was as severe as Judy later claimed, or whether she exaggerated to generate sympathy, one thing was clear. Her childhood was marked by instability, loss, and dysfunction. She learned early that the world was cruel, that trust was dangerous, and that survival meant looking out for yourself above all else. By her teenage years, Judy had developed the skill set that would serve her throughout her criminal career. She could present herself as normal, even charming. She could blend in. She could make people trust her. And beneath that surface, she was calculating every interaction, looking for advantage, viewing relationships as purely transactional. As a young woman, Judy trained as a nurse's aide. She learned about medicine, about symptoms and treatments, about how the human body functioned, and how it could be damaged. This medical knowledge would prove crucial in her future crimes. She understood pharmacology well enough to know that arsenic, administered in small doses over time, could mimic natural illness. She knew how to care for sick people, which meant she also knew how to make people sick. Judy already had a son, Michael, when she married United States Air Force Sergeant James Goodyear in 1962. Michael had been born out of wedlock, and this fact would haunt both mother and son. In the early 1960s, having a child without being married carried significant social stigma. For Judy, Michael represented shame, a mistake that followed her into her new marriage. Multiple accounts suggest Judy resented Michael from the beginning. He wasn't James's biological child. He was a reminder of her past, of decisions she regretted. And as the years passed, that resentment would calcify into something darker and more dangerous. James Goodyear seemed like a good match for Judy. He was an Air Force sergeant, a military man with steady income, comprehensive benefits, and, crucially, life insurance. They settled in Florida, building what appeared to be a normal military family life. James was deployed periodically, serving his country during the Vietnam War era. Judy kept the household running, raised the children, and played the role of dutiful military wife. 3 months after returning from a tour of duty in Vietnam, Goodyear was admitted to the United States Naval Hospital in Orlando, suffering from mysterious symptoms. He experienced severe nausea and vomiting, abdominal pain that wouldn't subside, weakness that grew worse by the day. He couldn't keep food down. His body was shutting down system by system, and doctors couldn't immediately identify why. They ran tests, blood work, X-rays. They considered tropical diseases he might have contracted in Vietnam, bacterial infections, undiagnosed cancers, but the symptoms didn't quite fit any standard diagnosis. James continued to deteriorate, growing weaker, his organs failing despite medical intervention. On September 16, 1971, James Edgar Goodyear died. He was 37 years old, a healthy military man who'd survived combat in Vietnam only to die mysteriously within months of returning home. His death was initially attributed to natural causes. An autopsy was performed, but toxicology screening in 1971 was rudimentary compared to modern standards. The doctors concluded he'd died of natural causes, possibly an undiagnosed illness, perhaps something contracted during his military service. James Goodyear was buried with military honors. His widow received condolences from the military community. Friends and family gathered to support Judy through this terrible loss, and Judy collected $85,000 in life insurance benefits. For a military widow with children to support, the insurance money seemed appropriate, a small compensation for devastating loss. No one suspected murder. Why would they? Judy had been a devoted wife. She'd stood by James through his deployments. She'd seemed genuinely distressed by his illness and death. She played the grieving widow role perfectly. But James Goodyear hadn't died of natural causes or tropical disease. Judy had been feeding him tiny amounts of arsenic, not enough to cause immediate, obvious poisoning, just small doses mixed into his food or drinks, gradually accumulating in his system. Over weeks and months, the poison destroyed his organs from the inside, his liver, his kidneys, his gastrointestinal system. By the time he was hospitalized, the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. And Judy watched him die, knowing exactly what was killing him. She visited him in the hospital, probably bringing him food and drinks, maybe even continuing to poison him there to ensure he wouldn't recover. She held his hand as his organs failed. She accepted sympathy from nurses and doctors, and when he finally died, she cried appropriately, accepted condolences gracefully, and cashed the insurance checks without hesitation. She'd gotten away with murder. and the success would embolden her to kill again. By 1972, Judy had a new boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris. In 1973, Judy moved to Trinidad, Colorado, with Morris. They built a life together, blending their families. Bobby Joe had his own connections and history. Judy had her children from her marriage to James. For several years, they lived in Colorado, far from Florida, and the memories of James's death. Bobby Joe probably never suspected he was dating a murderer. Judy seemed normal, a widow rebuilding her life, a mother caring for her children, a woman who'd experienced tragedy but was moving forward. She was probably charming, attentive, good at making Bobby Joe feel special and loved. But behind the facade, Judy was calculating. She took out life insurance policies on Bobby Joe. She had taken out 3 separate life insurance policies on Morris's life. 3 different policies from 3 different companies, ensuring that if something happened to Bobby Joe, Judy would benefit substantially. In January 1978, Bobby Joe Morris became ill, exhibiting the same mysterious symptoms that James Goodyear had shown before his death. The severe gastrointestinal distress, the progressive weakness, the inexplicable organ failure. He was hospitalized in Colorado, but like James before him, Bobby Joe couldn't be saved. He died by poison in January 1978. The pattern was repeating. Another man close to Judy had died mysteriously. Another set of symptoms that doctors couldn't quite explain in 1978. Another death initially attributed to natural causes. And another insurance payout for Judy Buenoano. Judy's daughter Kimberly would later testify during her mother's trials with a shocking claim that her half-brother Michael Goodyear had poisoned Bobby Joe Morris. Kimberly said that Michael did it because he knew that Morris was sexually abusing her. This testimony added a layer of complexity and horror to an already nightmarish case. Was Kimberly telling the truth? Was she protecting her mother? Or had Judy manipulated her daughter into lying on her behalf? However, Buenoano was never tried for Morris's death. Colorado authorities, learning about the case years later, found that enough time had passed and enough evidence had been degraded that building a prosecution would be difficult. Besides, Judy was already facing murder charges in Florida for crimes where the evidence was stronger. But investigators believed Judy had killed Bobby Joe Morris just as she'd killed James Goodyear, with arsenic administered slowly over time, accumulating until his organs failed. 3 separate life insurance policies, another dead partner, another payout. The pattern was clear, even if Colorado never formally prosecuted. After Bobby Joe's death, Judy legally changed her surname to Buenoano in 1978. The name was meant to be a Spanish translation of Goodyear, Buen Año meaning good year. It was a twisted homage to her first husband, the man she'd murdered. Or perhaps it was dark humor. These were indeed good years for Judy. She'd killed 2 men and collected substantial insurance money. She was financially secure, and no one suspected her of anything. Judy returned to Florida, settling in Pensacola. She opened a hair salon and nail salon, presenting herself as a successful businesswoman. She drove a Corvette. She wore expensive perfume. She told elaborate stories about her life and successes. To her customers and neighbors, Judy Buenoano seemed like someone who'd overcome tragedy and built an impressive life through hard work and determination. But within her own home, something horrific was unfolding. A crime so monstrous, it defies comprehension. Around 1980, Judy's son Michael, whom she had resented throughout his life because he was born out of wedlock, became severely ill. Michael had joined the army in June 1979, being assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, after basic training. He was 19 years old, young and physically fit, following in the footsteps of his late stepfather, James Goodyear. Michael wanted to serve his country. He wanted to build a future for himself. He had his whole life ahead of him. In 1979, Michael soon became ill and was diagnosed as suffering from arsenic poisoning, which rapidly affected his upper and lower limbs. En route to his new post at Fort Benning, Michael stopped off to visit his mother in Florida. It was supposed to be a routine family visit between assignments. A son seeing his mother before heading to his next duty station. But that's when Judy set her sights on him and poisoned him, feeding him arsenic. Think about that for a moment. Michael came home to visit his mother. He probably hugged her, talked about his army training, his excitement about his future, his dreams and ambitions, and Judy responded by poisoning him. The poisoning didn't kill Michael immediately, but he was crippled. Army physicians found 7 times the normal level of arsenic in Michael's body, and there was little they could do to reverse its destructive action. 7 times the normal level. The poison had saturated his system, destroying his nervous system, attacking his muscles and organs. His symptoms included paraplegia. A healthy 19-year-old soldier was suddenly partially paralyzed. After 6 weeks of care, the muscles of his arms and lower legs had atrophied to the point where he required heavy metal leg braces. The damage was catastrophic. Michael, who'd been running obstacle courses and doing physical training just weeks earlier, now couldn't walk without heavy braces supporting his legs. He was fitted with heavy metal leg braces and medically discharged into the care of his mother. His mother. The woman who'd poisoned him in the first place. The woman who'd watched him deteriorate from a healthy soldier into a partially paralyzed teenager, dependent on braces and wheelchairs. Michael must have been terrified and confused. Why had he suddenly become so sick? The army doctors had found arsenic, but where had it come from? Michael was discharged from the military with a disability, his dreams of a military career destroyed, his body broken at 19 years old. And he went home to live with Judy, trusting her to care for him. Did Michael suspect his mother? Or did he trust her completely, believing she'd help him recover? We'll never know what went through his mind during those months after his discharge, but we know what happened next. On May 13th, 1980, Judy took Michael on a canoe trip in the East River in Santa Rosa County, Florida. Mother and son out on the water on a spring afternoon. Michael, wearing his heavy metal leg braces, sat in the canoe with Judy. His paralyzed legs couldn't provide balance or strength. He was completely dependent on the stability of the canoe and his mother's. Help! Michael drowned. Investigators would later conclude that arsenic had crippled the teenager and that Judy pushed her son out of the canoe. With his paralyzed legs and those heavy metal braces weighing him down, Michael had no chance. He couldn't swim. He couldn't kick. He couldn't save himself. He sank into the East River and drowned while his mother watched. Or perhaps while his mother actively caused his death. Did she push him? Did she tip the canoe? Did she hold him under? The exact mechanics of how Michael ended up in the water would be debated in court, but the conclusion was clear. Judy had murdered her own son. Michael's final moments must have been absolute terror, feeling himself falling or being pushed into the water, the weight of the braces pulling him down, his paralyzed legs useless, water filling his lungs, calling out for his mother to help him, not realizing she was the one killing him. Drowning in a Florida river at 19 years old, murdered by the woman who'd given birth to him. Judy claimed it was a tragic accident. She told authorities that Michael had lost his balance and fallen from the canoe. She'd tried to save him, she said, but the water was too deep, the current too strong, and those metal braces made him too heavy. She'd watched helplessly as her disabled son drowned. She was devastated, she claimed. Another terrible loss in a life marked by tragedy. And once again she collected insurance money. Michael had been insured, probably through a policy Judy had taken out, and she was the beneficiary. Her 19-year-old son, whom she'd poisoned into paralysis and then drowned, became another financial windfall. 3 dead men, hundreds of thousands of dollars in insurance money, and still, no one suspected Judy Buenoano of murder. But Judy's killing spree wasn't over. Success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds recklessness. She'd gotten away with murder 3 times. She probably felt invincible, convinced that she was too smart to ever get caught. In the early 1980s, Judy began dating John Gentry, a successful businessman from Pensacola. He was charming, financially secure, and most importantly to Judy, insurable. She took out life insurance policies on John's life, just as she had with James, Bobby Joe, and Michael. The pattern was repeating once more. John Gentry had no idea he was dating a serial killer. Judy seemed wonderful, successful, attractive, attentive. She ran thriving businesses. She had nice things. She seemed like a catch. John fell in love with her, never suspecting that his girlfriend was already planning his death. In 1983, John Gentry began to fall ill. He experienced strange symptoms: nausea, weakness, confusion. His health deteriorated in ways that didn't make sense. His girlfriend, Judy Buenoano, had been giving him what she claimed was vitamin C. John trusted her medical knowledge. She'd been a nurse's aide. She seemed knowledgeable about health and wellness. When she gave him vitamins, he took them without question. Why wouldn't he? She was his girlfriend. She cared about him. Or so he thought. But chemists later determined that the pills were actually laced with the toxin paraformaldehyde. Judy was poisoning John, just as she'd poisoned James, Bobby Joe, and Michael. Several of the alleged vitamin capsules were recovered and found to contain arsenic. She was slowly killing her boyfriend with toxic substances, disguised as health supplements. But John's symptoms weren't progressing as quickly as Judy needed. The insurance policies had specific terms. She needed him dead sooner rather than later. The poisoning was taking too long. So Judy escalated dramatically. In June 1983, after a dinner date, a car bomb exploded and nearly killed John Gentry outside a restaurant in Pensacola. They'd had a pleasant evening. Dinner, conversation, the normal rituals of a couple dating. John walked to his car, turned the key in the ignition, and the world exploded. The bomb had been planted under his car, an effective device to kill anyone who started the vehicle. The explosion was massive. John's car was destroyed. He was thrown by the blast, injured and burned. But Gentry survived the explosion, and immediately, John became suspicious. The mysterious illness he'd been experiencing, the vitamins his girlfriend had been giving him, the life insurance policies she'd taken out, and now a car bomb that should have killed him. The pieces started coming together in John's mind. He went to the police. He told them about his deteriorating health, about the vitamins Judy had given him, about the insurance policies, and investigators started digging into Judy Buenoano's background. What they found was shocking. Multiple dead partners, multiple insurance payouts, a pattern of deaths that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Detectives identified Judy Buenoano as the main suspect in Gentry's violent attempted murder. When police learned about James Goodyear's death in 1971, they discovered that Buenoano was Spanish for Goodyear, and that Judy had been married to James Goodyear. The name change wasn't just an homage, it was a clue. Investigators requested an exhumation order for James Goodyear's remains. They found lethal amounts of arsenic in James Goodyear's remains. Even after 12 years in the ground, the poison was still detectable in his tissues and bones. James hadn't died of natural causes or mysterious illness. He'd been murdered by his wife, slowly poisoned over weeks or months. Authorities also exhumed Michael's body and found arsenic. The tragic drowning accident had been murder. Judy had poisoned her own son, crippled him, and then drowned him for insurance money. Exhumations of Bobby Joe Morris showed that he too had been given arsenic. Another victim, another poisoning, another murder that had initially been classified as natural causes. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 poisoned men, all insured with Judy as beneficiary, all dead under circumstances that appeared natural or accidental, but were actually murder. And now a 4th man, John Gentry, who'd survived only because the bomb hadn't killed him and because he'd gotten medical attention before the poison accumulated to lethal levels. In 1983, Judy Buenoano was arrested on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The woman who'd presented herself as a successful businesswoman and devoted mother was exposed as a serial killer who'd murdered for insurance money. Judy stood trial in 3 separate cases between 1984 and 1985. Each trial was a media sensation. The Black Widow case captivated Florida and garnered national attention. A woman accused of murdering her husband and son. A car bombing. Poison disguised as vitamins. It had all the elements of a crime thriller, except it was horrifyingly real. The first trial in 1984 was for the murder of Michael Goodyear. Prosecutors presented devastating evidence. The exhumed body showing lethal levels of arsenic. Army physicians' testimony about finding 7 times the normal level of arsenic in Michael's body. Medical experts explained how the poison had crippled the young soldier, destroying his nervous system and leaving him paralyzed. Then came testimony about the drowning. Investigators explained how Michael, wearing heavy metal leg braces, had no chance of survival if he went into the water. The canoe trip with his mother, the convenient accident, and the insurance policies that made Judy the beneficiary of her son's death. In 1984, Judy was found guilty of murdering her 19-year-old son Michael by systematic arsenic poisoning and drowning, resulting in a life sentence. The jury didn't believe her claims of innocence. They saw through her performance. She'd poisoned her own child and then drowned him. The verdict was unanimous. The second trial, also in 1984, focused on John Gentry. John testified about the mysterious illness he'd experienced, the vitamins Judy had given him, and the car bomb that nearly killed him. During his testimony, it appeared he was about to mention the bombing, and the judge had to warn him that doing so would prompt a mistrial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as John described trusting his girlfriend completely, only to realize she was trying to kill him. Vicky Lewis, who worked for Buenoano at her beauty shop, testified as well. Co-workers and acquaintances painted a picture of Judy as someone who talked casually about poison, who joked about murder, who seemed to view human life as disposable if it stood between her and money. Judy was found guilty of the attempted murder of John Gentry through poisoning and explosives, receiving a 12-year prison sentence. Another conviction, another jury that saw through her lies and recognized her for what she was, a calculating killer. The third trial, in 1985, was for the murder of James Goodyear. This was the case that would ultimately send Judy to death row. The exhumed body had revealed arsenic poisoning as the cause of death. Prosecutors presented evidence of James's mysterious illness after returning from Vietnam, his hospitalization, his death, and the substantial insurance payout Judy received. Two of Judy's acquaintances, Constance Lang and Mary Beverly Owens, testified that Judy had discussed with each of them on separate occasions the subject of killing a person by adding arsenic to his food. Lang testified that Judy had joked on several occasions about lacing her husband's food with arsenic. Owens testified that after hearing an upsetting phone call between Owens and her husband, Judy suggested that Owens poison her husband. Judy hadn't just committed these murders, she'd talked about them. She'd joked about poisoning. She'd suggested murder to her friends as a solution to marital problems. The testimony revealed someone with a casual attitude toward killing, someone who viewed murder as a practical solution to inconvenient situations. The defense tried to humanize Judy. They presented evidence of her difficult childhood, the alleged abuse by her father and stepmother, her struggles as a young single mother. They argued that she'd been shaped by trauma and hardship, that she deserved mercy. But the prosecution countered that millions of people experience childhood trauma without becoming serial killers. Judy's difficult past might explain some of her choices, but it didn't excuse murdering her husband and son for insurance money. In 1985, Judy was convicted of first-degree murder for the arsenic poisoning of James Goodyear and sentenced to death. The execution was scheduled for the 1971 arsenic poisoning of James Goodyear. Throughout all three trials, Judy Buenoano never admitted to any of the killings. She maintained her innocence, insisted she was being framed, claimed the deaths were coincidences. She portrayed herself as a victim of overzealous prosecutors and circumstantial evidence. Even when faced with exhumed bodies containing arsenic, with witnesses who'd heard her joke about poison, with insurance policies and timelines that made the pattern obvious, Judy refused to confess. Judy was sent to death row at the Broward Correctional Institution for Women, later transferred to other facilities within Florida's prison system. She joined a small population of women condemned to die, an exclusive and grim sisterhood of murderers. Life on death row is profoundly isolating. 23 hours a day in a small cell, 1 hour of recreation in a concrete yard, meals delivered through a slot, no physical contact with other inmates, years stretching into decades of waiting to die. Judy spent over a decade on death row. Her lawyers filed appeal after appeal, challenging her convictions and death sentence on various grounds. They argued that the trials had been unfair, that evidence had been improperly admitted, that the death sentence was disproportionate to her crimes, that her difficult childhood should have been given more weight as a mitigating factor. The appeals process is lengthy and complex. Each stage, state appeals, state habeas corpus petitions, federal habeas corpus petitions, can take years. Judy's case wound through Florida courts and then federal courts, with lawyers on both sides filing briefs, attending hearings, arguing legal technicalities. But the convictions and sentences were consistently upheld. The evidence was too strong. The pattern too clear. 3 dead men, all poisoned with arsenic, all insured with Judy as beneficiary. A 4th man who survived only by chance and quick medical intervention. The courts found no reversible error in the trials, no constitutional violations that warranted overturning the verdicts. During her time on death row, Judy gave occasional interviews. She maintained her innocence, insisted she'd been wrongly convicted, portrayed herself as a victim. In a prison interview broadcast on CNN's legal show Burden of Proof, she stated that she wanted to be remembered as a good mother. The claim was almost obscene. A good mother doesn't poison her son. A good mother doesn't cripple her child and then drown him for insurance money. A good mother doesn't turn her family into victims for financial gain. But Judy seemed genuinely to believe, or wanted others to believe, that she'd been a devoted and caring parent who'd simply had terrible luck. Some of her former employees and acquaintances remembered her differently. They recalled a woman obsessed with appearances, with status, with money. She drove around Pensacola in a Corvette, wore Chanel perfume, told grandiose stories about her businesses and her success. She needed to be seen as successful, as having made it despite her difficult past. And she was willing to kill to maintain that image and lifestyle. As the 1990s progressed and Judy's appeals were exhausted, it became increasingly clear that Florida would carry out her execution. Anti-death penalty activists rallied to her cause, arguing that executing a woman, especially one who claimed abuse in her childhood, was wrong. They organized protests, wrote letters to the governor, filed amicus briefs supporting her appeals, but victims' rights advocates and prosecutors pushed back. They pointed to Judy's victims, James Goodyear, who'd served his country in Vietnam and come home only to be murdered by his wife. Michael Goodyear, 19 years old, poisoned and drowned by his own mother. Bobby Joe Morris, killed in Colorado. John Gentry, who survived only by luck. These were real people with families who loved them, lives that had been destroyed or nearly destroyed by Judy's greed. On Sunday, March 29, 1998, the Florida Supreme Court rejected a last-ditch attempt by Judy's lawyers to stay her execution, finding no basis for further delay. All appeals had been exhausted. All legal avenues had been explored. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Judy's final days on death row were a mixture of routine and surreal preparation for death. She knew exactly when she would die. March 30, 1998, at 7 a.m. She had time to prepare, to make peace if she was capable of it, to say goodbye to the few people who still maintained contact with her. Judy requested a last meal, though the contents were never made public. It's a tradition in many states that execute prisoners, offering the condemned a final meal of their choice. Some request elaborate feasts. Others ask for simple, comforting foods. What Judy chose remains unknown, but she ate her last meal on the evening of March 29th, knowing that in less than 12 hours, she would be dead. She met with her spiritual advisor, a prison chaplain who'd counseled her during her years on death row. Did she confess? Did she finally admit what she'd done? The conversations between clergy and condemned prisoners are confidential, so we'll never know if Judy found genuine remorse or spiritual peace in those final hours. She was allowed final visits with family members. Her mother's innocence came to say goodbye. The relationship between Judy and her surviving children was complicated and damaged. They'd grown up with a mother who was a serial killer, who'd murdered their brother, who'd destroyed their family for insurance money. How do you reconcile that? How do you say goodbye to someone who's done such monstrous things? Judy slept fitfully, if at all, on her final night. Most condemned prisoners don't sleep much before their execution. The knowledge that dawn will bring death makes rest nearly impossible. She lay in her cell, counting down the hours, thinking about whatever occupies the mind of someone about to be executed for murder. March 30th, 1998, arrived cold and gray. Dawn broke over Florida State Prison in Stark, the maximum security facility that houses Florida's death row and execution chamber. Outside the prison, small groups had gathered, some protesting the death penalty, holding candles and signs arguing that the state shouldn't kill its citizens, regardless of their crimes. Others supported the execution, believing that justice demanded Judy pay the ultimate price for her murders. Inside the prison, Guards came for Judy in the early morning hours. Her head was shaved. This is standard procedure for electrocution. Hair interferes with electrical conductivity and can catch fire. Guards covered her shaved head with gel to ensure proper electrical conductivity. The preparation was clinical, methodical, designed to ensure the execution would be as efficient as possible. Gone were the painted, manicured fingernails and fashionable dark hair that had been part of Judy's carefully constructed image. Gone was the tough-edged woman who drove around Pensacola in a Corvette and told bigger-than-life stories about her life, her businesses, and her Chanel perfume. What remained was a 54-year-old woman in a prison dress, her head shaved, facing the last moments of her life. She was taken to a holding cell near the execution chamber where she waited for the appointed time. 7 a.m. That's when Florida conducts executions, early morning before the heat of the day, before the prison fully awakens to its daily routines. At 7:01 a.m., the door opened. Guards helped the frail-looking Buenoano walk into the death chamber at 7:02 a.m. The execution chamber at Florida State Prison is small and stark. In the center sits Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair, a massive oak chair with leather straps and metal components. It's been used to execute dozens of condemned prisoners since its installation. Barely filling the seat of the large oaken chair, she was strapped in. Guards worked methodically, securing leather straps across her chest, arms, and legs. Metal electrodes were attached, one to her shaved head, another to her right leg. She clenched her fists, shut her eyes, and lowered her head as prison officials securely strapped her into the wooden chair. Behind a glass partition, 46 witnesses watched in silence. She didn't look at the 46 witnesses behind the glass partition. Among them were prison officials required to witness the execution, media representatives who would report the details to the public, prosecutors who'd spent years building cases against her, and family members of her victims, people who'd waited over a decade for this moment, who'd attended countless court hearings, who'd fought to see justice done. The warden stepped forward and read the death warrant aloud. His voice was formal and measured as he detailed the court's order that Judy Buenoano be executed for the murder of James Edgar Goodyear. Then came the traditional question, "Do you have any last words?" Her eyes remained shut and she whispered, "No, sir." She made no final statement. No apology to James Goodyear's family, no acknowledgement of what she'd done to Michael, no expression of remorse for Bobby Joe Morris or John Gentry. Just 2 words, "No, sir," and then silence. The warden stepped back and nodded to the executioner, who was positioned in a separate room behind a one-way mirror. The executioner couldn't see Judy's face, a psychological buffer designed to make the act of killing someone slightly more bearable for the person pushing the button. At 7:08 a.m., the power was turned on. 2,300 volts of electricity surged through Judy Buenoano's body. She flinched, hands still in fists, as smoke rose from her bare right leg. Her body went rigid, every muscle contracting simultaneously from the massive electrical current coursing through her. The leather straps held her in place as her body strained against them. The current flowed for approximately 60 seconds. 60 seconds of controlled electrocution designed to shut down her nervous system, stop her heart, and end her life. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber, an inevitable and horrific consequence of electrocution. Smoke continued rising from where the electrode contacted her leg. The witnesses watched in varying states of emotion. Some looked away, others watched intently, wanting to see justice carried out. Still others wept, not for Judy, but for the victims, for the years of waiting, for the tragedy of lives destroyed by greed. When the current stopped, Judy's body slumped in the chair. Prison medical staff waited several minutes to ensure there was no remaining electrical charge, then stepped forward to check for vital signs. They felt for a pulse at her neck, checked her pupils, listened for breathing or heartbeat. The prisoner was pronounced dead at 7:13 a.m. EST, said Rhonda Haller, a prison spokeswoman who witnessed the execution. Judy Buenoano was dead. The state of Florida had kept its promise, executing her for the murder of James Goodyear. It had taken 27 years from the time she killed him until the morning she died for it, but the sentence had finally been carried out. It was the day that would have been her drowned son's 37th birthday, March 30th. Michael Goodyear, if he'd lived, would have turned 37 on the day his mother was executed. The timing was coincidental, but symbolically powerful. On the day that should have celebrated Michael's life, the state instead ended the life of the woman who'd murdered him. Judy became the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, a span of exactly 150 years. She was only the third woman executed in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976, and she was the first woman to die in the electric chair in America since Rhonda Bell Martin was executed in Alabama on October 11, 1957. The execution made national news. Major networks covered it. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the Black Widow who'd finally paid for her crimes. The coverage reignited debates about capital punishment, whether the death penalty serves justice, whether executing women is different from executing men, whether electrocution is humane or constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Outside Florida State Prison, as news of the execution spread, the protesters and supporters began to disperse. Some felt satisfaction that justice had been done. Others felt sickened that the state had killed someone regardless of her crimes. The debate would continue, but for Judy Buenoano, it was over. Inside the prison, Judy's body was removed from the electric chair and taken to a prison mortuary. An autopsy would be performed, standard procedure for executed prisoners, to officially document the cause of death and ensure the execution was carried out properly. Her body would later be released to family members for burial. John Gentry, the man who'd survived Judy's attempts to poison him and blow him up, released a statement expressing relief that she could never hurt anyone else. He'd lived for 15 years knowing that his former girlfriend had tried to kill him twice. The execution brought a measure of closure, though it couldn't erase the trauma of those experiences. The families of the victims waited decades. For them, the execution represented a form of justice, though it couldn't bring back their loved ones or heal the damage done by their murders. Kimberly Hawkins, Judy's daughter, had testified during the trials. Her relationship with her mother was deeply complicated. She'd grown up in a household where her mother was a serial killer, where her brother had been poisoned and drowned, where violence and greed had destroyed her family. After the execution, Kimberly would have to continue living with that legacy. The knowledge that her mother was a murderer, that her family's story was one of the most notorious crime cases in Florida history. Bobby Joe Morris's family in Colorado received notification of the execution. Though Judy had never been formally tried for his murder, they believed she'd killed him just as she'd killed James and Michael. The execution provided some measure of closure for them as well, even if Colorado's justice system had never formally prosecuted her. In the years since Judy's execution, criminologists and psychologists have studied her case extensively. She represents a specific type of serial killer, the Black Widow, named after the spider that kills its mate. These are murderers, almost always women, who kill family members or intimate partners for financial gain, usually through life insurance. What makes someone capable of killing the people who trust them most? What psychological profile allows a person to poison their own child, watch them become paralyzed, and then drown them? Judy's troubled childhood was real. The loss of her mother at age 4, the alleged abuse by her stepmother, the instability and dysfunction of her formative years. These experiences undoubtedly shaped her worldview and her relationship patterns. But millions of people experience childhood trauma without becoming serial killers. What distinguished Judy was likely a combination of factors: profound lack of empathy, narcissistic personality traits that made her view others as objects to be used rather than people with inherent worth, and a learned behavior pattern that relationships were purely transactional. She'd learned early that survival meant looking out for yourself, and she took that lesson to its most extreme conclusion, eliminating people when they became inconvenient or when their deaths could provide financial benefit. The medical knowledge she'd gained as a nurse's aide was crucial. Judy understood how poison worked, how to administer it in doses that would accumulate over time, how to make murder look like natural illness. In the 1970s and early 1980s, before sophisticated toxicology was routine, she could get away with arsenic poisoning because doctors didn't automatically suspect it. Her ability to perform normalcy was also key. Judy wasn't obviously disturbed or antisocial. She ran successful businesses. She presented well socially. She could charm people. This allowed her to kill repeatedly without raising suspicion. Who would suspect a successful businesswoman and devoted mother of being a serial murderer? The life insurance aspect reveals her fundamental motivation: greed. She collected more than $240,000 from her victims. In today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, that's well over $500,000. She killed for money, pure and simple. The victims' lives were worth less to her than the insurance payouts she'd received from their deaths. Judy Buenoano's case exists within a larger context of female serial killers who murder for profit. While male serial killers often kill for sexual gratification or because of sadistic impulses, female serial killers are much more likely to kill for financial gain. The Black Widow killer is a recognized type: women who murder spouses, partners, or family members and collect on insurance or inheritance. What's particularly chilling about these cases is the intimacy of the relationship between killer and victim. These aren't strangers. These are people who shared homes, beds, and meals with murderers. People who trusted completely and were betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Judy's case also highlights issues with life insurance fraud. She was able to take out multiple policies on the same person without raising red flags. In the wake of cases like hers, insurance companies have implemented better safeguards, cross-checking applications, requiring more thorough investigations before paying out large death benefits, looking for patterns that might indicate fraud or foul play. The case also reveals limitations in medical examination and cause of death determination, particularly in earlier decades. James Goodyear died in 1971, showing classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning, but it was ruled natural causes. Bobby Joe Morris died in 1978, with similar symptoms, also ruled natural. It wasn't until bodies were exhumed years later that the arsenic was discovered. Modern medicine is better equipped to detect poisoning, but in the 1970s, if doctors weren't specifically looking for it, they often missed it. What lessons can be drawn from Judy Buenoano's crimes and eventual execution? First, that evil can present itself in ordinary forms. Judy wasn't a monster in appearance or demeanor. She was a businesswoman, a mother, someone who could seem perfectly normal. This is a sobering reminder that we can't always identify dangerous people by how they look or act. Second, that patterns matter. Judy killed 3 people over 9 years, and each death was initially ruled accidental or natural. It was only when John Gentry survived and investigators looked at the bigger picture that the pattern became clear. This highlights the importance of thorough investigation and considering the context of someone's history. Third, that childhood trauma, while real and significant, doesn't excuse adult crimes. Judy's difficult early life was tragic, but it didn't give her the right to murder people. Millions of abuse survivors never harm anyone. Trauma explains, but doesn't excuse. Fourth, that the death penalty remains controversial even in clear-cut cases. Judy confessed to nothing, maintained her innocence, and was executed despite never admitting guilt. Some people believe this proves the death penalty is just, that society has the right to execute those who commit heinous crimes. Others argue that executing someone who maintains innocence, even with strong evidence, is ethically problematic. The debate continues. On the day of her execution, anti-death penalty protesters gathered outside the prison. They held signs, lit candles, and argued that executing Judy was wrong, that the state shouldn't kill, that she might have been rehabilitated, that execution doesn't bring victims back. Meanwhile, victims' rights advocates argued that justice demanded her execution, that some crimes are so heinous they warrant death, that Judy had shown no mercy to her victims and deserved none in return. In all the coverage of Judy Buenoano's crimes and execution, it's important to remember the victims, the real people whose lives were destroyed by her greed. James Edgar Goodyear was a United States Air Force sergeant who served his country honorably, including a tour in Vietnam. He survived combat only to come home and be murdered by his wife. He was 37 years old when he died in 1971. He left behind children who grew up without a father, family members who grieved his loss, and friends who remembered him as a good man and dedicated serviceman. James deserved to live a full life, to see his children grow up, to enjoy retirement after his military service. Instead, he died painfully from arsenic poisoning, betrayed by the woman he'd trusted most. Michael Buenoano Goodyear was 19 years old when his mother drowned him. He joined the army, following in the footsteps of his late stepfather. He had dreams and ambitions. He wanted to serve his country. Instead, his own mother poisoned him, watched him become paralyzed, and then killed him. Michael's final moments, sinking into the East River wearing heavy leg braces, unable to swim, calling out for help that never came, represent one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case. He was murdered by the person who should have loved and protected him most. He would have turned 37 on the day his mother was executed. Bobby Joe Morris died in Colorado in 1978, poisoned by the woman he'd built a life with. He thought he was in a loving relationship. He trusted Judy, and she killed him for insurance money. His death was initially ruled natural causes, and it wasn't until years later that investigators confirmed he'd been poisoned with arsenic. Bobby Joe's family never got to see Judy tried for his murder, though they believed correctly that she'd killed him. John Gentry survived Judy's murder attempts, but he carries the trauma of those experiences. He was poisoned by his girlfriend, then nearly killed when a bomb exploded in his car. He survived through luck and quick medical intervention. John had to live with the knowledge that someone he loved had tried to kill him twice. He testified at Judy's trials, helping to ensure she was convicted. While he survived physically, the psychological scars of being targeted for murder by an intimate partner must be profound. These are the people at the heart of this story. Not Judy and her troubled past, not the legal proceedings and appeals, but the victims, people who trusted someone who betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible, who died or nearly died because of one woman's greed. At 7:13 a.m. on March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano's heart stopped beating. The woman who'd murdered at least 3 people and attempted to kill a 4th was dead, executed by the state of Florida for her crimes. She'd wanted to be remembered as a good mother, but history remembers her differently, as the Black Widow, as a serial killer who murdered for insurance money, as a woman so devoid of empathy that she could poison her own son and then drown him. Her case remains a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can hide behind a pleasant smile, a successful business, a carefully constructed persona. Judy Buenoano seemed normal to her neighbors and customers. She seemed like a woman who'd overcome tragedy and built a good life. But beneath that surface was a calculating killer who viewed human beings as financial opportunities. The electric chair ended her life on a March morning in 1998. She was 54 years old, having spent over a decade on death row waiting for that moment. The execution closed a chapter in Florida's criminal history, but it didn't erase the damage she'd done. James, Michael, and Bobby Joe remained dead. John Gentry still carried trauma from her murder attempts. The families destroyed by her greed continued to bear those scars. Justice in the form of execution was delivered. Whether it was sufficient, whether it truly balanced the scales, whether the death penalty serves society, these questions remain subjects of debate. But what's undeniable is that Judy Buenoano killed multiple people for money, showed no remorse, maintained her innocence to the end, and died in Florida's electric chair for her crimes. She was the first woman to die in the electric chair in America since 1957. She was the first woman executed in Florida in 150 years. These distinctions made her execution historically significant, but they shouldn't overshadow the most important aspect of the case, that a serial killer who'd murdered for profit finally faced the ultimate punishment for her crimes. The smoke had cleared from the execution chamber. Judy's body had been removed. The witnesses had left. The protesters outside had gone home. And in cemeteries in Florida and beyond, the victims of Judy Buenoano's greed remained in their graves. James Goodyear, Michael Goodyear, Bobby Joe Morris. Their lives had been stolen. That's the true legacy of the Black Widow. Not her execution, not the legal proceedings, not even her crimes themselves, but the permanent damage done to the people who trusted her and paid for that trust with their lives. Judy Buenoano died on March 30th, 1998. She was a serial killer, a mother who murdered her own son, a wife who poisoned her husband, a girlfriend who tried to blow up her partner with a car bomb. She collected $240,000 in blood money, and in the end, she paid for those crimes with her life in Florida's electric chair. But the real story isn't about Judy. It's about James, Michael, Bobby Joe, and John. It's about the victims and their families. It's about lives destroyed by greed. It's about the price of trusting someone who viewed human relationships as purely transactional. The Black Widow is dead, but the pain she caused, the families she destroyed, the lives she stole, that damage is permanent and irreversible. And that's what we should remember when we think about Judy Buenoano. Not just that she was executed for her crimes, but that 3 people died because she valued insurance money more than human life. Justice came on March 30th, 1998, in the form of 2,000 volts of electricity. But justice doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't heal the wounded. It doesn't restore what was lost. It simply ensures that someone who killed repeatedly finally faced consequences for those actions. And so the story of Judy Buenoano, the Black Widow of Florida, came to an end in an execution chamber on a March morning. She lived 54 years. She murdered at least 3 people. She nearly killed a 4th. She collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in blood money. And ultimately, she died for those crimes, executed by a state that decided some acts are so heinous they warrant the ultimate punishment. The witnesses left the prison. The media filed their stories. The protesters went home. And in the small cells of Florida's death row, other condemned prisoners heard that an execution had been carried out and wondered when their own time would come. But for Judy Buenoano, time had run out. The woman who'd poisoned and murdered her way through 2 decades finally faced justice. The Black Widow was dead, executed for her crimes, and the victims she'd left behind could finally rest knowing that the woman who'd destroyed their lives had paid the price.